here in Oregon. I've been assigned to carry our 2023 TPA bill. This is our second stakeholder meeting on this bill. We had the first meeting back in December. I think many, maybe most of you attended that. Some of you maybe weren't able to. But first, I'm just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping because we do have quite a few people on the line. So we're not going to do introductions of everybody. There's just too many people for that. I do ask that folks can stay muted and turn your video off just to preserve bandwidth for everybody else, just to make sure everybody can hear the meeting. Unless you are speaking, if you have a comment or want to weigh in, please use the raise your hand function in Teams that's up at the top. Under reactions, you'll have a little hand you can raise. And when you do that, please, once you start speaking, let us know your name and who you're with, kind of, what your interest is in the bill. And we'll go from there. There will be some time we'll be taking some comments if anybody has them a little bit later in the agenda. So I also want to let everybody know we are recording the meeting today. We did that with our first meeting, had pretty good success with that. So we're going to do the same thing today. So you are being recorded. Please be aware of that. And we will distribute a link to the meeting for anybody who needs it after the meeting. Our agenda for today. So I don't have a ton of materials. I don't have a presentation today. My hope for the meeting is after our first meeting on December 1st, we had asked for comments back a little after Christmas. I did get a handful of comments back, so I kind of want to talk through those a little bit, just on a high level, kind of, the big picture comments that we heard back and kind of our responses to those. That'll be the first part of the meeting. Then we will kind of open it up again, just if anybody else has comments that they wanted to bring today. In particular, anybody maybe who wasn't at the first meeting or who hadn't provided written comments, we'd really like to hear from you. That'll probably be kind of the majority of the meeting, and that'll go as long as people have things to say. So it could be very short, could go the whole time. I personally don't have anything. The meeting's scheduled to go to 11:30 Pacific. I don't have anything after this, so if we need to, I can stay on longer. But if folks don't have a whole lot to say, then we'll just move along. And then we'll close with sort of some next steps. And basically, I'm just kind of going to ask at the end, we'll talk about this at the end, but I'm trying to get a pretty good sense of where people are at with the bill, what their level of comfort is, who might be neutral or supportive, and kind of figure out exactly where the opposition, if there is any opposition, where that opposition is, and if there's anything we can do about it. Okay, so I'll go into sort of the comments we received. So just to give a little background, we had our first meeting at the start of December. We distributed a draft of a proposed amendment. So our bill has now been introduced. I believe the number on it is 12. Oh, shoot, I should have looked this up. Well, I don't have my email open, but I can pass that along. But the bill has been introduced, so it is out there. We know that the version that was introduced probably needs a little work done. So our hope was to kind of bring this group together and try to work towards something of a consensus amendment, touching on a few different things that we're looking at. We walked through that draft last time, and then I had asked for comments. So got about 3 or 4 comments back. Most of those came from our licensed health insurers. And I'll just kind of walk through kind of the biggest things that came back in those comments. Probably the biggest issue that we heard about and that was raised, and really all the comments we got back were just sort of concerns about ERISA and ERISA preemption specifically. So our bill is proposing to require all TPAs doing business in Oregon to be licensed with us. That includes TPAs that are working with self-funded ERISA plans. Currently, those types of TPAs are required to register with us, but they are not required to hold a full license. So kind of what we're hoping to do is change that, basically remove the exemptions that create that state of affairs, and just say across the board, everybody who's acting as a TPA in the state of Oregon would need to have a TPA license issued by the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation. Several people raised, we got a lot of feedback. didn't really get a lot of detailed analysis on the ERISA preemption question. Most of the comments that came back were sort of, we think this raises ERISA concerns. This could be preempted. Some people said it was preempted. So today, what I kind of wanted to just share is, that number one, I said this in the first meeting, but, we understand that. We're aware of the ERISA preemption problem. And we are trying to kind of craft something that kind of finds where that line is between, what can sort of states do in this area around TPAs. The case law that's really on point is somewhat minimal, but I do understand there is at least one case that we are aware of where a court upheld a state licensing requirement for TPAs, including those that administer self-funded ERISA plans. I put this in the chat, but the case that we're looking at is Benefax Corporation versus Wright. That is 757 F Sup 800, and that comes to us from the Western Division of Kentucky. It's a 1990 case, so it is a little bit older case. But basically, I think if you look at the rationale in that case, essentially the court, held that the impacts of this licensing, of the Kentucky licensing statute on ERISA plans were pretty attenuated and distant, such that that court did not think that it was the type of thing that ERISA sought to preempt. So that's sort of kind of been our lodestone as we've worked through this, is trying to align what we're trying to do with, that what we understand to be the law in Kentucky and what we understand to still be the law in Kentucky, which is, their statute does not distinguish between the type of plan that a TPA is working with. It just says, if you're a TPA doing business in the state, and in so many words, it says, you have to be licensed to do that activity. So, so that's kind of our thought on the ERISA piece. We realize that, there's a distinction between licensing a TPA and what you can do with that license. So we are trying to be mindful of not stepping across the line and stepping into the land of affirmatively regulating ERISA plans. But we do think we can, we believe we can add this requirement to have all the different TPAs licensed with us. And that's really what the draft, we provided is trying to get at. So I can, I put a link to that case. I can distribute a copy. I do have a printed copy of it, and I can send that out after the meeting. And I see Marianne Cooper, you've got your hand up, so go ahead. I'm happy to take your comment.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies for not being on video. I'm at my office today and I don't have a camera. But I just question on kind of how you would propose to draw the distinction, because it's not entirely clear to me in the bill, around requiring licensing versus subsequent regulation, especially because I think some of the justification was, well, if we get, complaints or concerns related to, the kind of third party, insurance, then we want to be able to be responsive to those. And so to me, that kind of suggested at least some intent, if there is a complaint or a concern, to regulate in some manner. And so I just wanted to make sure I understood kind of how you were drawing that distinction and what activities you thought would be something that DFR would look to regulate for those kinds of plans versus when they tell, somebody who had a complaint or a concern, hey, sorry, we don't regulate there. Does that question make sense?
It does make sense, and I appreciate the question. Trying to think how best to answer it. So the line, where is the line, right? And I that was actually in one of the comments we got. One of the comments I received, they sort of said, which I agree with it. They just sort of said, I think we all kind of need to get our heads around where this line is in Oregon, right? So industry, external stakeholders, legislators, and even us as the regulators. I think we need to kind of come to some kind of understanding of where the line is. So to some extent, I think that's up for debate. And, maybe that's one of the things we're trying to work through in this process. What's on the table currently in the bill And this is in, I should say, in the amendment. So the bill that was introduced would have just basically removed the exemptions for self-funded plans and insurers and just said everybody needs to be licensed with us, and all those other regulatory powers that are in I think it's 744, the TPA statute. So things like requirements about what's in the contract between the TPA and the payer. The ability to access as us as a regulator accessing the books and records of the TPA. So, their records of claim payments and things like that, their interactions and their business records. We are not proposing. So kind of where the line is, what I'm talking about for the amendment and what I hope comes across in the amendment is that we would like to expand the license requirement to all TPAs. So even if you're in that bucket of, I'm a TPA that only does self-funded ERISA plans, that's the only thing I administer, we would say you have to be licensed with us. We would not, though, as far as those other powers, those things about like what has to be in the contract, the insurance requirements, like the E&O insurance, the rules around books and records, all those sort of regulatory pieces, those we would retain only our current jurisdiction on. So those would only apply in the case of a fully insured plan, the same way they do today. So the only change I think that we're really trying to focus on is really capture the licensing piece. The one thing that does by making it a license, we think, is it opens up our director's inquiry statute. So we have authority to send inquiries to a licensee. Now that statute is cruxed in terms of, I believe it's the language of something like any appropriate inquiry or something like that, which we would take to mean, yes, we could send you an inquiry as a self-funded plan, but if the answer to that is, look, it's a self-funded plan, that would basically be sort of the end of the inquiry, right? Except for the one thing I think that we did talk about last time is the case where maybe that you've got a company that does a mixture of fully insured and self-funded. So I think the one, you have sort of a mixed portfolio as a TPA. In that case, well, maybe the particular plan we're inquiring about is self-funded, and that would be the answer. But we may want to know, well, is this same thing happening in your fully insured business? But that piece, again, I think would already fall under our, that would be a function of the inquiry. So I think we could ask that question and expect an answer on that. But I don't think we would be in a place but that would be strictly, again, refocusing on the fully insured side of the house and not looking to delve into self-funded. That's kind of how I'm thinking about the line, but I hope that answers your question.
And Michael, I see Jen has her hand up, but just as a follow-up to make sure I'm looking at the right thing, I didn't see any amendments to the original, I think the one that was dated December 1, which I read as kind of opening everything up. So are you saying there's an amendment to come that would narrow it back down from what we've seen? Or are you saying that you think the December 1 language is narrow?
I believe that the December 1 language should be narrow in the way I just described. It should be expanding the license requirement, but not applying the books and records, the contracts, or any of that other stuff to the self-funded market.
Can you walk, and I'll let Jen go next because maybe I'm just reading it wrong, but can you kind of point out to me how that functions? Because I know, I think we had some concerns internally about the December 1 language and didn't read it as being exceptionally narrow. And so I just want to make sure I kind of understand how you guys are interpreting it so I can take that back.
Yeah, and maybe hold that thought a little. There's a couple technical points that I was going to touch on later, but to answer the essence of your question, I think you really need to focus on the use of the word payer, which is a term we were going to add to the definitions. And that is a broader term that includes both insured plans and self-funded employer-sponsored plans. So I think the key is the use of when we use the word payer versus when we use the word insurer as you work through the bill. Because the use of the term insurer that's what's in the law now. So to the extent that we're just standing on insurer in the books and records and things like that, we would interpret that to mean that that would allow us to do everything we could do already on the fully insured house, but by not using the word payer in those sections, that's what's going to limit us just to the fully insured business. I hope that's helpful.
It is. So I'm now looking on page 8, 744, 740, sub 5, and it says the payer has the duty to provide competent administration of its programs administered by a third-party administrator within the scope. Are you saying that's almost kind of the only obligation that you're putting on a payer in the statute?
Yeah, and that was the piece that I was gonna. We're gonna.
Are we
change
getting there?
that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Hold.
No worries. There's no good way to get through this.
Apologies. Thank you.
That's the. I was going to cover that in a bit, but yeah, we did get a comment specifically on that point, and I think we're going to go with. We're going to remove the word pay. There were a couple instances. So, sorry. Let me back up. The version that was introduced used the word payer throughout. Every time it said insurer, they replaced that with payer. And that's what would put you in this spot of having all these additional regulatory powers over the self-funded plans. The amendment that I'm proposing and that we've been talking about in these meetings would pull those changes back out and basically leave those sections at just insurer.
Okay.
And I think we missed a couple on our first go around, but the intent is basically it will really just be the license statute would use the word payer and the remainder of the bill would talk about insurer, just like it does.
Okay.
Those sections would basically not change from current state.
Okay. That's super helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Jen, I think you've got your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Michael. And I'm kind of following up on a few things. And so if you're going to get to this, please just let me know. But I just want to clarify, following up on Marianne's questions. So, in your original presentation, you did some slides that talked about the need to give better access to consumer complaints and that sort of thing. And so I'm curious, when you are saying that, it sounds okay. So you require TPAs to get licensed. You can look at our books. You can look at all the things that you can already do as a fully insured, HCSE or insurer payer in Oregon. But if you send us a complaint, a consumer complaint, and we say, sorry, this is a self-funded plan, redirect to Department of Labor, you're going to be okay with that then? Is that correct?
So let me try to walk through what you're saying. I think the answer is yes, but let me just try to say it back to you and make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Right. So we get a consumer complaint and they say, I'm insured with, I'll use your company, Providence, right? And then they've got an issue. We would send you, our usual process. We would, send you our letter that you get and say, hey, we heard from this member, ... And it turns out, okay, that's a case where you're acting as the administrative service, the ASO or the TPA.
Correct.
You're not insuring that plan, but you're acting as a TPA.
Mm-hmm.
I think in that case, I think we might want to have a side conversation specifically to talk through this. But I think we would accept the answer that no, this is the self-funded plan, right? So that would mean we as DFR would not have any enforcement or real regulatory authority on that instance. I think we would like to be able to get back from you some sense of what that consumer can do, right? So some sense of here's who they could contact, here's how they can redress that, or something to where we could go back to that consumer and be like, well, it's a self-funded plan. It's not subject to our regulation, but some sense of here's kind of what your options would be.
But it wouldn't be required.
What's that?
It wouldn't be required because, as long as we say, please redirect your complaint, because the regulating entity is the Department of Labor. So for a self-funded plan, you'd want to redirect that person to the regulating authority that can actually garner the information that's needed to solve the case, the specific case, right? Because the DFR won't be able to require coverage on a self-funded plan. They won't be able to require action on coverage. So, I feel like you might be taking the consumer down a road that won't give them the satisfaction that they would get if they were directing their question and their concern and their complaint to the actual regulating authority. So, I mean, again, and this just kind of goes back to the whole, like, what's the purpose of this bill? I mean, okay, you require TPAs to get licensed, that's fine, but, you know, you still can't require TPAs to force the payer, right, to provide coverage. And so that's what I'm trying to understand. What are you trying to accomplish if you can't compel, data require, you can't compel the payer to respond to requests for, more detailed information around that particular consumer complaint?
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of current state, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I don't think we would have essentially jurisdiction, maybe not jurisdiction. I can't think quite the right word, but we would not be able to really work that complaint all the way to resolution. That would not fall within our regulatory authority because it is a self-funded plan, right? The one thing that I would say, though, that I think there's interest in on our part is if we get a pattern of those types of complaints and such that it might suggest there's a bigger operational issue within the payer, we might want to ask you, okay, so far we've gotten some complaints on this in the self-funded world. We understand those aren't ours.
Right. I get that.
Is that also happening on your fully insured business? That question.
I get that, Michael, but yeah. You can already do that, right?
I agree. Yeah, exactly. And
what's the point of this bill if you can already do all the things that you're saying you want to be able to do, right? You can always submit a market conduct inquiry saying, hey, we're seeing some complaints on the ERISA self-funded side. We want to know how are you operating on the fully insured side? You have that authority. That's a director's inquiry you can do and complete to resolution. And so I don't understand why we need this legislation. I mean, what is the ultimate purpose? What are you trying to accomplish?
Right. And I think the answer to that is what you just said is accurate for your sort of use case as a health plan, right? But there are other TPA activities I think that we've encountered where we think the licensing would come in handy.
And all I'm asking is if you could make that clearer to what kind of activities you're trying to have more access to, or a better, I mean, like, because it doesn't seem like there's anything that you want to do you can't already do given current statutory regulatory authority.
Got it. Okay, that's a fair comment. I will take that back.
Thanks, I'm done.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Jen. I got a hand up from Jessica Roth, and before you go, Jessica, I do have a few more things I needed to get through. So I think right now we're really talking about this ERISA preemption piece. So if your comments about something else, it might I'm not just saying that to you, I'm saying that to the group, but go ahead. I'm happy to hear what you got to say.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's nice to follow on the heels of my dear friend, Jen. It's nice to see you again, Jen. I wish you hadn't left the family fold to go to Providence, but it's good to be back in your stead in this meeting. My question, Michael, more specifically is on the difference between licensing of a TPA. So my TPA technically is a non-resident TPA today. Is the intent for a non-resident TPA to basically stay the same as it is today, except for the fact that maybe there's additional fee that might need to be tied to a license? At the end of the day, based on what you're talking about, since only self-funded plans is what we deal with, we don't have fully insured. We're a classic third-party TPA for self-funded plans, trying to get a better sense of really what's changing. We already file annual reports. We already do all payer database stuff. So at the end of the day, it sounds like there's a different licensing fee and we may need to get an actual license. But is there going to be a requirement to force us to become a resident TPA if our home state doesn't license TPAs? I'm curious about that and what your approach is that way. I know Idaho has a position on that. I'm wondering if Oregon's looking to take a similar approach to what Idaho does in this regard, or if it's, hey, as long as you're licensed, resident, non-resident, we're good, just like we are today with registration. And that's pretty much, at the end of the day, the only thing that changes. There's no expectation that you have to ensure your plans cover certain state benefit mandates. There's nothing that's going to get wonky that way, which starts to run into a risk of preemption for us pretty quick. It's just purely changing us from a registered TPA to a licensed, but the lift is not going to be that much different. Is that a fair assessment on my part?
I'll give you a fairly tentative, yes, that is kind of, I think, how we've been thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah, because the one thing I guess that's kind of tripping, you talked about a resident versus possibly a non-resident TPA. What we have currently in Oregon is there are rules around when sort of a non-domestic, a company that isn't located here needs to be licensed with us, and it basically turns on your Oregon enrollment. So I think the current state of what would be in the amendment would maintain all of those. Like
Okay.
it's not changing any of those, and I think it's fairly low. It's either 100 or 1,000 lives. I don't want to say, I say that gingerly because I don't have it in front of me, but you know, if basically the idea is if you're doing a sufficient amount of Oregon, you have enough of an Oregon presence to fall within the statute, that's the moment then you would have to be licensed with us. But that, I think that should be the same rule of whatever it is for the registration. Like we're not proposing to change that. It would change from the registration scenario to the license scenario.
Okay.
If you're meeting those, whatever those thresholds are to need to have the Oregon license.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. So fundamentally, other, concerns about scope and that aside, the annual reporting requirements and all that, it's really not intended to change from what it is today. It's more of a one-time fee each renewal cycle, and all the things that we would do today as a registered TPA or whatever stands. It would just be basically re-characterized from a registration on file to being a license. And is there any transition such that what we already have basically gets converted to a license as part of sort of this transition, or does everybody just basically start from scratch and goes through licensing as if we're coming to Oregon for the very first time and you've got no history, no information already on file? Does that make sense?
The question definitely makes sense. I don't think I can answer it. That kind of gets into mechanics of, right? You're currently registered with us, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, I think I'll give sort of a general statement that, yeah, I don't think I can speak to exactly what the process for that transition would look like, but I think that's something we'd want to, talk through and work with on more of an operational sort of level, and what our licensing system can handle, and what what that would require sort of technically to get there. But I do think we would want to make that as minimal, to the extent we already had information about you, if that could be ported into the license side, I think we'd want to have that conversation, right? Like we wouldn't be looking to make it any more onerous than it needed to be, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
That I would appreciate that. I mean, as simple as you can make it for us. So what's already there is fine, and we just need to fill in the blanks with anything that you don't already have that makes transition a little bit easier. I guess the other question is, and this is going to be another mechanics question, so forgive me, is if a TPA's otherwise registration is due to come up for renewal kind of during this period where, you're not transitioned yet, I assume the expectation is the same old, pay your registration fees, whatever, and that those, I'm hoping, will be kind of credited and applied towards licensing costs or anything like that, as you guys are thinking through how do you move us from registered TPA status to licensed. Be really good if some of that kind of carries over for the benefit of, and it's not I mean, your fees aren't that big, it's a couple $100, but if we're paying $100, making it up for registration fee, and then we got to pay another 200. It'd be great if that 100 counted towards the overall 200 obligation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so definitely hear you. I kind of want to qualify this with, I am not the ops guy and I don't have the technical knowledge to know how all that data lives. So I don't want to make any statement about what it would look like beyond, yeah, that we try to work with you. But I think what I'm getting from your comment is we should think about effective date and what, the transition, right? So if you're currently on a certification that expires on a certain date, I'm thinking out loud, the cleanest way would be you would come up for license at the expiration of your current registration. But I think I need to work through more of the technical pieces on that. But we would try to make it as smooth as we could.
That's fine. I mean, generally, I don't have a lot of heartburn over what you guys are trying to do. I think that making sure the lines are clear around kind of unintended consequences for our clients. So if clients disagree with covering certain state benefit mandates, the TPA is not put in a lose-lose position where we can't take clients on if they don't wish to cover that. I think those are important kind of cornerstones of being a TPA supporting self-funded. There's a reason they're not fully insured, right? They don't want to cover certain requirements, and Oregon has typically been pretty robust with state benefit mandates, right? So I think that's certainly a concern for us. But otherwise, in terms of changing from a registered to a licensed TPA, as long as the transition plan makes sense and it's reasonable and it's as low administrative lift as possible, I think we would be supportive of that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and just specifically on the point of state required benefits, I think I hope this calms your nerves. Like, yes, I totally agree that I think that there's a lot of loss on a lot of the ERISA stuff, but I think the one thing that's universally clear is that, yeah, a state could not say to an ERISA self-funded plan, you have to cover XYZ, that would be something central to plan administration and is not something a state could dictate. So we would not be thinking that changing from a registration with us to a license with us now means that all the plans you're administering have to cover Oregon state required benefits. We understand that is not the case.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Okay. Seeing no hands up. So that's kind of the first big thing we heard about was the ERISA piece, and good discussion there. Thank you. We also had several comments come back talking about, asking about the fee amount and the fee study. I currently, excuse me, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, sorry. Yeah, people had asked about the fee study. I kind of heard from different things. I heard kind of like we just heard, a lot of people saying, yeah, that fee makes sense and that's consistent with what we're paying in other states. I did have a couple comments. Some of the comments did say, though, that they would like to see us do a full fee study. I guess I just want to say my understanding on the fee study is that is not something that is statutorily, like that it's not a legal requirement that we would have to do that. That being the case, I did kind of talk to some of my folks that work on this stuff, and kind of the issue we would have is we do not track, historically, we have not tracked the time spent on TPA applications specifically. So I think that would probably, we think we could probably come up with something of a fee study, but it might be a little bit tricky. I would also mention that, the one thing I did hear is that honestly, if we probably really did a truly robust fee study, we might come up with a higher amount than what we've been talking about, which was the $200 a year. So, the way we came up with the fee we do have is we tried to do a survey of all the other states and sort of see where they were. We definitely thought our current fee at $45 was low. And so, we'll continue to look at that and work on that and try to make sure we're putting a fee out there that is reasonable and reflects our costs. So I guess that's what I have to say on that. And I see Marianne, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Michael, that makes sense. And I think when I was talking to our folks internally, I was talking about that $200 per year will become $200 per year or an amount adopted by the department by rule. How do you doing those, like if say 5 years from now, you're like, man, $200 just isn't cutting it. We need to raise it. how would you look at doing that? And I presume there would be robust stakeholder engagement. Like sometimes I feel like it's a, I've seen statutes have like a, you know, you can't increase it by more than X% or whatever, and this is pretty open-ended. So I just wanted to make sure, kind of flagged the question of like, how are you going to go about determining that, say 5 years in the future, $200 isn't cutting it, and you need to look at increasing that fee.
Yeah, well, if it's helpful, I guess I can tell you that, you know, I really put in that language about having the ability to increase it by rule sort of somewhat as a matter of course, just because we were going to specify a dollar amount in statute, you know, and that at some date in the future, that may come to seem, you know, you may want to increase that and not want to have to go back to the legislature necessarily to do that. So that's really the only thing I was thinking in adding the rule authority to increase the fee. As far as how we typically do it, I don't know that I can answer that, because I think we've been charging $45 for renewals since this statute went on the books sometime around 1990 or so. So I don't think it's something that we were actively looking at of like, oh yeah, let's get this amount and then we'll come back in a year or 2 or 3 or whatever and do an increase. It
But I
really was
presume
sort of,
there'd be some stakeholder engagement and
Yes.
conversation and kind of normal rule process followed for that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. If we came to that point that we thought we needed to do an increase, we would go through that whole process, bringing stakeholders, trying to really see, well, you know, why is it deficient? What would it need to be? And trying to present all that information through, you know,
Okay.
public rulemaking.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I talked about this a little bit. We got into this a little bit, but then the other thing I wanted to mention in the comments, we did get a couple of fairly specific technical corrections suggested to us. I didn't go ahead and do a revised draft because they were very minor. But somebody did mention the piece, I think we talked about it earlier, about we still were using the word payer in ORS 744740. I think our plan would be to not use that term and just have that section just say insurer. We kind of mentioned that earlier. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, I realized, and this was an error on my part, and I did this both in the draft and when I was talking about it in the last meeting. I believe I was saying using the term certification when I should have been saying registration. There's a spot. Oh shoot. I think it's in 7447023. I inserted the word register, and it talks about, you know, that nothing in this statute extinguishes the obligation to have a license under any other statute. And I meant to add the word or registration, but I put in certification. So that was just my brain got the two words crossed up. So it should say the intent of that was to talk about any other registration requirement. And in particular, I think we were thinking about, you know, the requirement for PBMs to be registered, pharmacy benefit managers to be registered with us under 735532. So those are kind of in the weeds changes. But I just wanted to mention those, that, yeah, we would try to not, we would eliminate the use of payer from that statute, and also clarify when we said registration, we should have said certification. So I don't know if that's clarifying or more confusing to go through that, but wanted to mention that. Okay, some good discussion there. So I just, before we leave this, just anybody else that submitted comments that thinks I either, you know, didn't represent something, didn't speak to something, or glossed over anything that they wanted to bring up, I'll give you a chance to weigh in, anybody who submitted comments and that has anything else they wanted to say about them. Okay, seeing none. I think the next thing we had on our agenda was just sort of essentially kind of an open discussion. And maybe we got through some of that already. Appreciate the conversation, but if anybody, I was just kind of going to open up the floor a little bit tentatively. Anybody who had anything else they wanted to bring up that hasn't been spoken to, or any additional comments they wanted to provide, I guess I would just kind of open up the floor. In particular, maybe anybody who wasn't at the first meeting, even if you just have a basic question or clarification, or if you had something more substantive, would be happy to take those now if anybody has them. Okay, not seeing anybody. Okay. So unless there's anything else, I will say, so I think in terms of next steps, so where are we? So I think we have, we've got the draft from the December 1. What I would propose to do is I can go ahead and get a new draft out to the group, making those couple of technical changes that I mentioned. I should be able to get that out today. I kind of held on that in case there was any more substantive conversation, but since I'm not hearing any, what I would propose is I can get you guys a draft with those changes that we talked about. We are kind of getting down to crunch time. We're already in January, so I think we kind of like to move the conversation more. I'm hearing from some people they're kind of okay with this. I'm hearing from other people they may still have some reservations. So I think what we'd like to do now, my ask of you, based on everything you've heard, and if you have a chance to review what we presented today, maybe take a look at that case I talked about. I'd like to get a sense now of where people are at in terms of specifically people who have concerns or would intend to oppose the bill. If you're if you're not okay, because we would like to introduce this as a consensus amendment. If you're either not neutral or not able to support it, if you've got issues, I think we'd like to kind of drill down to who has those and what those issues really are. So I would like to, if I can, I would like to give folks about a week, if I can, and I would like to get comments back by January 17th at kind of a high level of, if you're still opposed, let me know that, and then also kind of the nature of your concerns and maybe a sense of if there's anything, that could be done to alleviate those concerns. So my ask is that folks respond to me by end of day on January 17th. If you still have hesitations, reservations, I'd like to make those known so that we can kind of really start focusing on those. Again, be presenting those to leadership here in the division, and we can try to work from there towards, something that we want to bring forth and kind of figure out our next steps from here. So the ask is, if you're opposed, please let me know by January 17th so that I can get a sense of kind of where the group is at. I'm not going to ask people to put that in front of all your colleagues here, so you can just send those to me. If you're good with the bill, comfortable with the bill, I don't need to hear from you. I'm really trying to get a sense of where are the sticking points at this point. So if you can let me know, I would appreciate that. And I see Marianne, you've got your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, I don't need to take 50 people on this journey, but do you have time maybe later this week to spend some more time on kind of as it relates to health insurance, the problem that we're trying to solve? Because I think some of what Jen said kind of resonated with me of like, what can you do now? What would be new authority here? Because I feel like that's probably the biggest question I'm going to get is like, wait, I thought they could do that now. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? And if it's more just financial, I think that's a different conversation versus kind of a change in authority, because it sounds like you're wanting to effectively call it something different, but have it function very similarly to how it functions now. And I guess still have some lingering questions about kind of what the problem is we're trying to solve, just so I can make sure I'm explaining it internally correctly. So I just wanted to flag that, but maybe you and I can connect offline if others don't have similar questions.
And I just want to, Michael, Jen Baker, Providence,
Yeah, go ahead.
Reiterate the same exact thing. Like, until the DFR makes it clear what you're trying to accomplish in terms of being able to do something you can't already do, I think we will have concerns. I think most carriers will probably have concerns. So, but I don't want to speak for others. I just want to say our concern is, what is it you're trying to accomplish that you can't already do? And the real need for this kind of legislation. I'm not concerned about being a licensed TPA. I'm just not understanding what the goal here is. And I feel like it's not crystal clear for all of us.
And just to make sure I'm tracking, I think you're talking specifically kind of the case of you're you're already a licensed health insurer, what does this bill mean to you? Sort of a dedicated conversation for the health plans,
Right.
maybe?
You mentioned there's some TPA activities that, I wasn't necessarily referencing in my particular, fact pattern, if you will. But so what are specific activities? Like, give us some examples of what you're trying to accomplish with this bill that you could not already do with given like current statutory and regulatory authority.
Got it.
I mean,
Okay.
how will this impact consumers? Because to me, just me personally thinking, like if I'm a consumer and I file a complaint with the DFR and I'm led to believe that I might be able to be brought to some sort of resolution, and yet it's a self-funded plan who's like, we're not going to give you that resolution because you're not the governing authority. Like, I think it could ultimately confuse consumers.
Okay. I will take that as a comment and I will try to noodle on that, and I will try to come up with some more information for you on that.
Thanks.
All right. Anybody else, for the good of the order, have comments, questions, anything they wanted to bring up while we've got all these folks together? Going once? All right. I will send a follow-up email after the meeting with a couple of things that we discussed today, just so everyone knows. I'll also try to get you just a revised draft, and then I'll be looking for, just some feedback on, make sure we got a sense of where folks are at on it. Like I said, if you're comfortable with what you've heard, or, you're either supportive or neutral, don't necessarily need to hear from you, but, really trying to find out where the pain points are at this point, and we'll try to work through those. So thank you. And I think we can adjourn. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the conversation and the engagement on this.
Thank you.
Thanks all.